MMA fighters challenged the 80-year-old until he put the champion on the ground. In seconds, act Metambas, the Iron Temple. MMA gym occupied a converted warehouse in the industrial district, where the sound of bodies hitting mats and fists hitting bags echoed through concrete and steel. The space was functional rather than fancy. Heavy bags hanging from reinforced beams, an octagonal cage for sparring, weight equipment scattered around the perimeter, and mats that had absorbed years of sweat and blood. The morning class was in full swing when James Chen walked through the door. He was 80 years old, though he moved with a fluidity that suggested someone decades younger. He stood 5'7", lean and wiry, with silver hair cut military short and hands marked by old scars and calluses that told their own story. He wore simple black jive pants, a plain gray t-shirt, and bare feet that had spent more time on training mats than in shoes over the past 65 years. The gym owner, Marcus the Mauler Johnson, 42, former UFC middleweight contender, now running this gym with a reputation for producing serious fighters, looked up from coaching a grappling session and frowned. "Can I help you, sir?" Marcus's tone was polite, but carried the subtle impatience of someone assuming this was a lost grandfather looking for directions. "I called last week," James said quietly. "Asked about training here. You said to come by and we'd discuss it." Marcus's frown deepened as he tried to recall the conversation. "Oh, right. James Chen, I thought..." He paused, clearly having expected someone much younger. "How old did you say you were?" 80, turning 81 in October. Several fighters stopped their training, attention drawn by the novelty of an octogenarian asking about joining an MMA gym. A few exchanged amused glances. One whispered something to his partner that caused quiet laughter. "Mr. Chen, I appreciate your interest, but this is a serious combat sports facility. We train professional fighters, amateurs competing at high levels, people preparing for actual matches. I'm not sure we're equipped for senior fitness classes." "I'm not looking for senior fitness," James said evenly. "I'm looking to train, maintain my skills, stay sharp, work with people who understand combat. What's your background?" This from Derek the Demolisher Watts, the gym's star fighter, 28 years old, undefeated in 12 professional MMA bouts, training for a title shot. He was 6'2", 200 pounds of muscle and confidence, with the casual arrogance of someone who'd never been seriously challenged. Various martial arts, started with Judo at 15, added other disciplines over the years, spent time studying in Okinawa, Brazil, the Philippines, trained some with the Gracies in the 80s before BJJ became popular here. Derek laughed. "You trained with the Gracies? Which one? Helio's grandfather?" More laughter from the other fighters. James didn't react, just stood calmly, hands relaxed at his sides. Marcus raised a hand to quiet his students. "Mr. Chen, I'm sure you've had an interesting martial arts journey, but MMA is different from traditional arts. It's full contact, it's intense, and honestly, the liability of having someone your age training here..." He trailed off, trying to find a diplomatic way to refuse. "I'll sign whatever waivers you need," James said. "I understand the risks. I've been training in combat arts for 65 years. I know my limitations and my capabilities." 65 years of kata and forms, maybe," Derek interjected. "But have you ever actually fought? Real fighting, not point sparring or prearranged demonstrations?" James looked at him directly, and something in his eyes made Derek's smirk falter slightly. "Yes, I've fought." "Where? Local tournaments? Karate competitions?" "Other places, different circumstances." Marcus decided to take a different approach. "Tell you what, Mr. Chen, why don't you show us what you've got? Just some basic movement, maybe demonstrate a technique or two. Help us understand what level you're at so we can figure out if this is a good fit." James nodded slowly. "All right." He walked onto the main mat, the fighters gathering around to watch what they clearly expected to be an embarrassing display from an old man who didn't understand how out of his depth he was. James stood in the center, took a moment to center himself, then began to move. The movement was unlike anything most of them had seen. Not the aggressive muscular power they associated with MMA, but something else, fluid, economical, perfectly balanced. James flowed through positions that showed complete body control, transitions between stances that revealed deep understanding of weight distribution and structural alignment. "That's very pretty," Derek said after a minute, his tone dripping with condescension. "But it's not fighting, it's dancing. Show us something that would actually work in the cage." James stopped, turned to face Derek. "What would you like to see?" "I don't know, old man. Show us how you'd handle a takedown. Or better yet, Show us what you'd do if someone actually tried to hit you. I'd need a partner for that. Derek grinned. I'll be your partner. Don't worry, I'll go easy on you. Marcus started to intervene. This was a bad idea on multiple levels, but James spoke first. Light contact only. I don't want anyone getting hurt. Sure thing, Pops. Light contact. Derek stepped onto the mat, bouncing on his toes, hands up in a modern MMA guard. He was playing to the crowd now, winking at his training partners. Come on, show me what 65 years of ancient martial arts looks like. James didn't take a fighting stance. He just stood naturally, hands low, weight evenly distributed. To the watching fighters, he looked completely unprepared, vulnerable, easy prey. Derek feinted a jab, testing. James didn't react. Derek threw a light kick toward James's lead leg, telegraphed, slow, giving the old man plenty of time to move. James didn't move. Instead, his shin met Derek's kick with perfect timing, checking it effortlessly. The impact made Derek wince, shin-on-shin contact that the old man seemed not to notice, but that sent a jolt through Derek's leg. Lucky block, Derek muttered, shaking it off. He came in more seriously now, throwing a combination, jab, cross, lead hook. Fast, technical, the kind of striking that had finished 8 of his 12 professional opponents. And James simply wasn't there. He slipped outside the jab, turned his body to let the cross pass by his head, and as the hook came around, he stepped in rather than away, getting inside Derek's range where the punch had no power. Now James was close, too close, and his hands moved with sudden, startling speed. One hand controlled Derek's lead arm, the other his head. And before Derek could process what was happening, James executed a perfect koshi guruma, a hip wheel throw that used Derek's own forward momentum against him. Derek went up and over, landing flat on his back on the mat with an impact that drove the air from his lungs. The entire sequence had taken less than 2 seconds. The gym went silent. James stood over Derek, not gloating, just waiting. Are you all right? Derek lay there, stunned, staring at the ceiling, trying to understand how he'd gone from throwing strikes to flat on his back without any transition his brain could track. What the hell was that? One of the other fighters breathed. James extended a hand to help Derek up. Basic judo, hip throw, using your momentum. You committed too much weight forward on the hook, left yourself vulnerable to the angle change. Derek ignored the hand, rolled to his feet on his own, face flushed with embarrassment and anger. I wasn't ready. You sucker threw me. You were mid-combination. You were definitely ready. James's tone carried no mockery, just statement of fact. You telegraphed the hook, dropped your left hand after the cross, and leaned too far into the power. Those are fixable habits, but they're exploitable. Bullshit. I want a rematch. For real this time, no holding back. Marcus stepped forward. Derek, stand down. No way. This old man got lucky, caught me off guard. I want to actually spar him, see what he's got when I'm really trying. James looked at Marcus. It's all right. If he needs to understand clearly, we can go another round. Light contact, like before. I don't need light contact, Derek snapped. I need to actually fight, not play patty cake with Grandpa. Derek, Marcus started, but James interrupted quietly. Full contact then, if that's what you need. The other fighters were whispering now, some concerned, others excited by the prospect of seeing their gym champion put this old man in his place. Marcus looked torn between stopping this and letting it play out. 1 round, Marcus said finally. 3 minutes. And Derek, if he gets hurt, this is on you. He won't get hurt, Derek said, confidence returning. I'll just take him down and hold him. He'll tap as soon as I get pressure on him. They reset on the mat. This time, Derek didn't showboat or play. He came in with serious intent, shooting for a double-leg takedown, the bread and butter of MMA, the move that had launched 1,000 UFC careers. James's response was so fast that several fighters missed it entirely. As Derek shot in, James sprawled, but not the typical sprawl they taught in wrestling. This was something older, something that redirected rather than just resisted. James's hips went back, his weight went down, but his hands were already controlling Derek's head, and before Derek could establish grips, James had spun around to the back, taking position. Derek, face down on the mat, with an 80-year-old man on his back, tried to roll, tried to explode up, tried everything his wrestling coach had taught him. Nothing worked. James's weight distribution was perfect. His hooks were in, his control was absolute. And then James's arm snaked around Derek's neck. Not a crude choke, but a perfectly positioned rear naked choke, cutting off blood flow to the brain with surgical precision. Derek had maybe 3 seconds to tap before he'd go unconscious. He tapped frantically, and James released immediately, rolling away and standing in one fluid motion. The gym was dead silent. Derek lay on the mat, gasping, one hand to his throat, staring at the ceiling in absolute disbelief. That was newaza, James said quietly. Groundwork. You left your head exposed during the shot, didn't establish your grips before I established mine, and tried to use strength instead of position to escape. Again, all fixable. But there are fundamental errors that someone with your record shouldn't be making. Marcus moved to Derek, checking on him, but his eyes were on James. Mr. Chen, where did you say you trained? I didn't, specifically. But I started in military combatives, expanded from there. Spent years studying various systems: Judo, Jiu-Jitsu, Aikido, some karate, some kung fu, some silat. Took what worked, discarded what didn't. Tested everything in circumstances where effectiveness mattered more than style. Military combatives, Marcus repeated. What branch? Army initially, then other organizations, different operations over the years. One of the other fighters, an older guy, maybe 35, with a military tattoo visible on his shoulder, spoke up. What unit, sir? James looked at him, and something passed between them, recognition of a shared language, shared experience. First Special Forces Group, originally. Then some time with Delta. Then other work that didn't have unit designations. The fighter straightened slightly, his demeanor shifting from casual interest to respect. How long? Active duty until 94. Contract work and training after that, on and off, until about 10 years. Ego? Marcus was recalculating everything. So, when you say you've fought, I've fought, not in cages, not for points or prizes. In places where losing meant dying, where technique had to work against people who wanted to kill you, where pretty forms meant nothing, and effectiveness was the only measure. Derek had finally gotten to his feet, still looking shaken. You were Special Forces? Was. Long time ago. And you just, what, came to our gym to show off? Prove you could embarrass us? James shook his head. I came to train, to stay sharp, maintain my skills, work with people who take martial arts seriously. I don't need to prove anything to anyone, but when you insisted on sparring, I responded honestly. What you saw wasn't me showing off. It was me functioning at about 30%, using basic techniques that should work on anyone who leaves those openings. The implication hung in the air. Derek had been thoroughly dominated by an 80-year-old man who wasn't even trying hard. Marcus made a decision. Mr. Chen, I'd like to offer you a membership, full access, train whenever you want, and... He paused, choosing his words carefully. I'd like to ask if you'd be willing to teach some seminars, share some of what you know with our fighters. They need to understand that there are levels to this beyond what they see in the UFC. James considered this. I'm not interested in teaching full-time. Don't want that responsibility. But occasional seminars, showing specific techniques, answering questions about applications, that I could do. That would be valuable. Derek was still standing there, looking lost. James turned to him. You're a good fighter. You have speed, power, decent technique. But you've developed habits that work against lower-level opposition, but leave you vulnerable to people who know what to look for. If you're willing to listen, I can show you where your game has holes. Why would you help me after I was a dick to you? Because you're young and talented and those holes will eventually get you hurt. Better to fix them now than learn the hard way. James headed toward the door, preparing to leave. I'll be back Thursday morning if the offer stands. We can discuss the details then. As James left, the gym erupted in conversation, excited, disbelieving, replaying what they'd just seen. Marcus watched the old man go, understanding that something significant had just walked into his gym, and Derek stood on the mat, still processing that he'd been completely outclassed by someone his grandfather's age, using techniques so fundamental and effective that Derek hadn't even understood what was happening until he was already defeated. ACT 2. James returned Thursday morning, as promised. This time, the atmosphere was different. The mockery gone, replaced by cautious curiosity and, from some of the fighters, genuine respect. Marcus had organized a small seminar, about 15 of his regular students including Derek, who'd shown up early and was stretching with unusual focus. James arrived in the same simple training clothes, barefoot, carrying nothing but a small gym bag. Thank you all for coming, James began, standing at the edge of the mat. Before we start, I want to be clear about what I can teach and what I can't. I can show you techniques that have proven effective in real combat situations. I can help you understand principles that transcend specific martial arts styles. What I can't do is make you better overnight. Mastery takes years, decades, a lifetime of refinement. What I can offer is perspective. He paused, meeting various eyes around the circle. The martial arts most of you practice. BJJ, Muay Thai, wrestling, boxing. They're excellent systems, tested in competition, refined through thousands of hours of practice. But they're designed for specific contexts: rules, weight classes, time limits, referees. What I learned was designed for a different context. No rules, no weight matching, no time limits, no one to stop the fight. Understanding that difference is critical. So, what you do is better? One fighter asked, not challengingly but genuinely curious. Not better, different, more brutal, less sporting, focused purely on ending threats as quickly as possible. There's an ugly truth about real violence that sport fighting can't fully prepare you for. In actual combat, there's no honor, no respect, no appreciation for technique. There's just survival. What works in that context looks different from what works in the cage. James stepped onto the mat. Let me demonstrate some principles. I'll need a volunteer. Derek stood immediately. I'll go. All right, come here. Try to take me down, same as Tuesday. But this time, understand that I'm going to show everyone watching what I see, what I'm reading from your approach. Derek shot in, faster and more technical than before, adjusting for what hadn't worked last time. But James's response was different now too. He didn't just sprawl and take the back. Instead, he used Derek's momentum to turn him, off-balancing him mid-shot. And as Derek tried to recover, James's hands were suddenly around his head in a position that made Derek freeze completely. See where my hands are? James addressed the watching fighters while maintaining control. Right hand under his chin, left hand behind his head. From here, I can do several things. Snap his neck with a twist, collapse his windpipe with pressure, or just control his posture completely. In competition, this position doesn't exist because it's illegal. But in real combat, this is where many fights end. He released Derek, who stood rubbing his throat. Derek, tell them what you felt. Like I couldn't move without making it worse. Every instinct said don't struggle or something breaks. Exactly. Your body's survival instincts recognized the threat. Now, let's look at why you ended up there. James reset Derek's position, walking through the takedown attempt in slow motion, pointing out the moment when Derek's head position became vulnerable, when his neck alignment put him at risk. For the next 2 hours, James worked through techniques and principles that the fighters had never seen, or had seen but never understood the deadly applications of. He showed them how common positions in BJJ had roots in battlefield arts where the goal wasn't submission, but killing. He demonstrated how traditional martial arts techniques that looked useless in MMA became devastatingly effective when you removed the rules about eye gouges, throat strikes, joint breaks. But he also showed them the costs. This technique, James said, demonstrating an arm break on a training dummy, will completely destroy the elbow, not dislocate, destroy. Ligaments, tendons, possibly bone. The person will need surgery, extensive rehab, and may never fully recover function. I've done this to people. In the moment, it was necessary. But years later, I still think about those men, wondering if they can hold their children, if they can work, if that single moment of combat violence shaped the rest of their lives. The room was quiet. This wasn't the usual MMA training, where tap-outs meant everyone was fine and you'd train again tomorrow. This was something else. One fighter, a woman named Sasha, who competed in amateur MMA and worked as a bouncer, asked, "How do you live with that, knowing you've permanently hurt people?" James sat down on the mat, the other fighters following suit, the formal seminar transforming into something more like a conversation. You compartmentalize, initially. In the military, in combat situations, you tell yourself it was necessary, that it was them or you, that those were the rules of the game you were all playing. And that's true, as far as it goes. But it doesn't make the weight disappear. How many people have you... Derek trailed off, not quite able to finish the question. James was quiet for a long moment. I've killed 11 people in hand-to-hand combat. Not shooting, not at distance. Close enough to see their faces, feel them stop struggling, watch the life leave their eyes. 11 confirmed, possibly more in situations where I couldn't confirm outcomes. And I've seriously injured dozens more. Broken bones, destroyed joints. Trauma that they carried for the rest of their lives. The silence was profound. These fighters threw strikes and grappled and submitted each other daily. But this was different. This was someone who'd used these arts for their original purpose, taking human life. The first one was in Vietnam, James continued, his voice distant. 1971, I was 26 years old, on a reconnaissance patrol that went bad. Enemy soldiers stumbled into me in dense jungle, too close for weapons. It became a grappling match, dirty and desperate, nothing like the clean techniques we practice. I ended up behind him, choke hold, and I held on until he stopped moving. Took maybe 2, Minutes? Longest 2 minutes of my life. His face stayed with me. Young guy, probably my age, terrified in those final seconds when he understood what was happening. I can still see it, 54 years later. Still remember how it felt. The moral weight of taking a life with your own hands instead of with a weapon from distance. Derek spoke up, his voice subdued. Do you regret it? I regret that it was necessary. I don't regret surviving. That's the complexity you live with. Understanding that your survival required someone else's death, and having to make peace with both the necessity and the cost. James looked around at the faces watching him. The martial arts I'm teaching you today, they're not games, they're not sports. They're killing arts that have been modified for training purposes. Every technique we practice has a lethal application. Every position you learn to hold can be used to break bones or end lives. You need to understand that weight, respect that responsibility. Is that why you came here? Marcus asked. To make sure we understood the weight. Partly, but also because I need to keep training. The skills deteriorate if you don't maintain them, and I can't let that happen. Why not? You're 80, retired from whatever military work you did. Why keep training in combat arts? James's hands clenched slightly, then relaxed. Because stopping means letting go of the one thing that defined most of my life. The training, the discipline, the understanding that your body is a weapon that needs constant maintenance. It's who I am. Take that away, and I'm not sure what's left. He stood, shaking off the heavy mood. Let's go through some more techniques, defensive applications, ways to protect yourself without necessarily destroying your opponent. The brutal stuff has its place, but there's also an art to controlling without seriously harming. They trained for another hour, James demonstrating joint locks that could restrain without breaking, holds that could control without crushing, the fine line between submission and permanent damage. He was a patient teacher, correcting positions with gentle hands, explaining the biomechanics behind why certain angles worked and others didn't. But the fighters were different now. They'd glimpsed something beyond sport, understood that the man teaching them had lived in a world where these techniques meant life or death, and that understanding changed how they approached the training. When the seminar ended, several fighters stayed to ask questions, to seek advice on specific techniques, to thank James for sharing knowledge that went far beyond what they'd expected. Derek approached last, after everyone else had left. Mr. Chen, I wanted to apologize again for Tuesday. I was disrespectful, assumed you were just some old guy who didn't know what he was talking about. I was wrong. You didn't know my background. Your assumptions were based on appearance and age, which is understandable. Still, I should have been more respectful. Derek paused, struggling with how to phrase his next question. Can I ask you something personal? Those 11 people you killed, do they haunt you? Do you see them? James looked at him directly. Every one of them. Not as nightmares, not anymore, but as memories that surface in quiet moments. I remember their faces, their expressions, the moments before and after. I remember being 26 and taking my first life, and being 42 and taking what I thought would be my last. I remember all of it. How do you live with it? By continuing to live, by training, by maintaining discipline, by passing forward knowledge, so maybe the next generation handles these situations better than I did. By understanding that what I did was necessary at the time, even if I wish those times had never come. James picked up his gym bag. The weight doesn't disappear, Derek. You just get stronger at carrying it. That's all any of us can do. ACT 3. 3 months into training at Iron Temple, James had become a fixture. He came 3 mornings a week, worked out alone mostly, occasionally joining group sessions or offering quiet corrections when he saw dangerous habits forming. The fighters had learned to watch him, the way he moved, the economy of his technique, the absolute precision of every action. Marcus had asked him to teach a regular Friday morning class focused on traditional martial arts principles applied to MMA. James had reluctantly agreed, finding that he enjoyed teaching more than he'd expected, even as it brought up memories he'd spent years trying to quietly manage. One Friday after class, Derek asked if James would stay and work with him privately. I've got a fight coming up in 6 weeks, title eliminator, against a guy who's known for dirty boxing and clinch work. I know I've got the skills to beat him, but I need to be sharper, more efficient. I want to understand combat the way you do, not just technique, but the mindset. James agreed, and they spent an hour working through scenarios. James showing Derek how to read intentions through subtle body language, how to feel an opponent's weight distribution through minimal contact, how to enter and exit danger zones with minimal exposure. You're thinking too much, James said, after watching Derek work through a defensive sequence. Your technique is good, but you're processing consciously instead of reacting instinctively. In real combat, there's no time to think. You see, you feel, you respond. The decision-making happens faster than conscious thought. How do I get to that level? Time and experience. Thousands of hours of practice until the movements become reflexive. But there's a shortcut. Pressure testing under realistic conditions. You need to spar against people who aren't following sport rules, who are trying to actually hurt you within training-safe parameters. Like with you. Like with me, if you want. But understand, if we spar for real, if I'm trying to simulate actual combat conditions within safe bounds, it's going to be intense. It's going to show you things about yourself that might be uncomfortable. Derek nodded. I want that. I need that. They cleared the mat. Just the two of them now, Marcus watching from the side. James explained the rules. Everything legal in MMA, plus small joint manipulation, pressure points, strikes to the back of the head, all simulated at light contact. If I get you in a position where I could end the fight with illegal techniques, I'll tell you and we'll reset. The goal is for you to understand when you're in real danger versus sport danger. They began, and Derek immediately understood the difference. Every exchange ended with James controlling him, not with the clean techniques they practiced for competition, but with messy, effective combat applications. Fingers in the eyes, pulled at the last moment. Palm strikes to the throat, stopped short. Knees to the groin, redirected. Techniques that referees would stop, but that street fights or combat situations wouldn't. After 15 minutes, Derek was exhausted and humbled. He'd been killed at least a dozen times by techniques he'd never properly defended because they weren't part of his training context. Now you understand, James said, barely winded despite the intensity. In sport, you have a referee protecting you, rules limiting what opponents can do. In real violence, none of that exists. Every opening you leave can be exploited lethally. Every mistake can be your last. Derek sat on the mat, processing. How did you survive so many combat situations? How did you not make a fatal mistake? James sat beside him. I made plenty of mistakes. I just got lucky that they weren't fatal, and I lost people who weren't as lucky. What do you mean? James was quiet for a long time, deciding how much to share. I spent years training other soldiers, special operations, people headed into the worst situations. Hand-to-hand combat instructor, close quarters battle, anything involving using your body as a weapon. I taught hundreds of people, maybe thousands over the years. That's incredible. Some of them died. James's voice was flat, emotionless. Died in combat situations where maybe better training would have saved them. Died because the techniques I taught them weren't perfect, weren't comprehensive enough, didn't account for every variable. Or died because they didn't learn well enough, didn't practice enough, and when the moment came, the skills weren't there. That's not your fault, isn't it? If I'm the instructor, if I'm responsible for preparing people for life or death situations and they die, whose fault is that? The enemy's, circumstance, or mine for not being a good enough teacher? Marcus moved closer, drawn into the conversation. James, you can't carry that weight. You gave them the best training you could. What they did with it, how they performed under pressure, that's on them, not you. That's what I told myself for years, but the faces still come back. Thompson, who I trained in '89, died in Panama when his team got ambushed and his close quarters skills weren't sharp enough. Rodriguez, trained in '93, killed in Somalia when he hesitated in a knife confrontation. Hesitated because I'd taught him to control force, to not be excessive, and that hesitation cost him his life. Pak, who I trained in 2002, died in Afghanistan when he tried a disarm technique that I'd shown him, but he wasn't fast enough, and the enemy soldiers shot him. James's hands were clenched, knuckles white. 8 students total that I know of who died in situations where hand-to-hand combat skills were involved. 8 people who trusted me to prepare them for survival, and I couldn't do it well enough. The weight in the room was crushing. Derek and Marcus both understood they were hearing something James rarely spoke about. Wounds that hadn't healed despite decades of distance. Is that why you stopped teaching? Derek asked quietly. Why you retired from military work? Partly. The weight accumulated until I couldn't carry it anymore. Every new class, every new student, I'd see the 8 faces and wonder if I was preparing more people to die, if my teaching was flawed, inadequate, missing something critical. So I stopped, told myself I'd done enough damage for one lifetime. But you're teaching now, here, with us. Because the circumstances are different. You're not going into combat situations. You're sport fighters, facing controlled violence in regulated environments. The stakes are lower. If I teach you poorly, you lose a match, not your life. That's weight I can carry. Marcus shook his head. James, those 8 soldiers, they didn't die because you taught them badly. They died because they were in combat, in situations where death is always possible regardless of training. You gave them tools to survive. That's all any instructor can do. Is it? Because I go over every technique I taught them, wondering if I'd explained it differently, demonstrated it better, been more demanding in training. Would they have survived? Thompson was slow on his reaction time. I noticed it, commented on it. But I didn't drill it harder because I didn't want to discourage him. Rodriguez was tentative about using lethal force. I tried to teach restraint and judgment, but maybe what he needed was commitment and ruthlessness. Every one of them had small weaknesses I noticed, but didn't correct strongly enough, and those weaknesses killed them. Derek spoke up. With that logic, you should also take credit for everyone you trained who survived because of your teaching. How many people lived through combat situations using techniques you taught them? James was quiet. I don't know. Dozens, maybe hundreds. I've gotten letters, emails, occasional visits from former students who wanted to thank me, tell me that something I taught them saved their life in Iraq or Afghanistan or Somalia. So the ledger balances. 8 lost, hundreds saved. It doesn't work that way. The ones who died aren't balanced by the ones who lived. They're separate weights, separate burdens. And the ones who died are heavier because I failed them. They sat in silence for several minutes. Finally, Marcus spoke. James, I asked you to teach here because I saw mastery, saw skills and knowledge that could help my fighters improve. But I'm starting to understand that what you're really teaching is about more than technique. You're teaching us to respect the weight of violence, to understand that what we practice as sport has roots in arts designed to kill, and that understanding that history is part of honoring the arts. Maybe, James acknowledged, or maybe I'm just an old man trying to find meaning in decades of violence by passing forward knowledge and hoping it does more good than harm this time. Derek stood, extended his hand to help James up. Whatever your reasons, I'm grateful. What you've taught me in 3 months has made me a better fighter and a better person. You've shown me that there's depth to martial arts beyond competition, that the physical techniques are connected to philosophy and responsibility and understanding consequences. James accepted the help, stood slowly. Thank you. That means more than you know. As they prepared to leave, Derek asked one more question. Those 8 students you lost, do you remember their names? Every one of them. Thompson, Rodriguez, Pak, Gonzalez, Chen, Williams, Okoye, Martinez. I think about them regularly, pray for them, in my own way. Try to honor their memories by being a better teacher now, by learning from what I did wrong and applying those lessons. That's all anyone can do, Derek said. Carry the weight forward and try to be better. Yes, James agreed quietly. That's all anyone can do. AC. Bonf. 6 weeks later, Derek's title eliminator fight arrived. James came to the arena, his first time attending a live MMA event in years, and watched from seats Marcus had reserved. The fight was brutal, technical, exactly the kind of high-level combat that made MMA compelling. Derek fought with a different quality now, still aggressive, still powerful, but more economical, more precise. He used angles James had taught him, recognized danger in his opponent's positioning that he would have missed 3 months ago, and when the finish came in the 3rd round, it was a perfectly executed rear naked choke that showed James's technical influence. After Derek's hand was raised after the interviews and celebration, he found James in the back corridors of the arena. I won, Derek said, still euphoric with adrenaline. I actually won. You did, fought intelligently, stayed calm under pressure, found the right moment to finish. Well done. I kept thinking about what you taught me, about reading intentions, feeling weight distribution, understanding when someone's committed to a position they can't recover from. That's what set up the finish. I felt him commit too much weight to the single leg defense, knew his neck was there, and took it. James smiled. Good. That's application of principles, not just technique. That's understanding. Derek's expression grew serious. I wanted to tell you something. During the fight, during the 2nd round when I was tired and he was pushing hard, I started to panic, started to question if I was good enough. And then I thought about you. 80 years old, still training, still maintaining discipline despite carrying weight that would crush most people. If you can show up and train at 80 after everything you've been through, I can push through one more round. You inspired me to keep fighting. James felt something crack open in his chest, grief and gratitude mixed together. That means everything to me. Thank you for telling me. The Iron Temple underwent a transformation over the following months. James's regular Friday classes had grown from 5 students to 20, then to 30, Fighters coming from other gyms to learn from the old master, who could submit champions despite being decades older. But the classes had evolved beyond just technique. James taught philosophy too, the responsibility that came with knowing how to hurt people, the discipline required to control violence instead of being controlled by it, the weight that effective martial artists carried, whether they acknowledged it or not. The techniques I'm teaching you, James told a packed class one morning, they're not toys, they're not party tricks to show off with. They're tools that can end careers, break bodies, take lives. You need to respect that power, understand that with knowledge comes responsibility. The better you get at fighting, the more important it becomes that you never fight unless absolutely necessary. One student, a young fighter named Marcus Jr., son of the gym owner, asked, "But isn't the point to be the best fighter, to win championships?" That's one point, yes, but being the best fighter means understanding when not to fight. Means having the confidence and skill to walk away from confrontations because you know you could win but choose not to. Real mastery isn't about dominance. It's about control, discipline, choosing peace when violence would be easier. James shared more stories from his military career, carefully edited versions that removed classified details but conveyed the weight. He talked about situations where violence had been necessary and situations where it hadn't been but happened anyway, about the difference between justified force and excessive force, about living with consequences decades after the actions that created them. The fighters listened with attention that went beyond typical martial arts instruction. They were receiving something rare, wisdom from someone who'd used these arts in their original context and understood both their power and their cost. Sasha, the bouncer, approached James after class one day. "I had to throw someone out of the club last weekend, big guy, aggressive drunk, starting to get physical with patrons. I used a control technique you showed me, the standing wrist lock with body positioning, and walked him out without anyone getting hurt. He fought it initially, but once he felt the control, he complied. I wanted to thank you for teaching me how to handle that situation without escalating to strikes or submissions." "That's exactly the right application," James said, pride evident in his voice. "Violence as a last resort, control as the goal. You did well." These moments accumulated, students applying what James taught in their lives outside the gym, using his instruction to avoid fights rather than win them, understanding that true strength included restraint. Marcus approached James 6 months into his teaching tenure with a proposal. "I want to create a formal instructor certification program. Have you trained selected students to teach what you teach so that when—" He paused, uncomfortable with the implication. "When I'm gone," James finished for him. "It's all right, Marcus. I'm 80. Mortality isn't a distant concept. I don't want this knowledge to disappear. What you're teaching, it's too valuable to lose. Will you help me develop a program to preserve it?" James considered carefully. This was the responsibility he'd avoided for years, investing in people, training them deeply, risking that his teaching might fail them, as it had failed 8 soldiers decades ago. But he'd also learned something over these months at Iron Temple. The weight of teaching was lighter when shared, when students took ownership of the knowledge instead of just receiving it passively. "Yes," James said finally. "I'll help. But we do it right. Rigorous standards, emphasis on philosophy as much as technique. Understanding that what we're passing forward is a tradition that demands respect." They developed the program over the following year. James selected 6 students who showed not just technical aptitude, but the character and judgment required to teach combat arts responsibly. Derek was among them, along with Sasha, Marcus Jr., and 3 others who'd proven themselves over months of dedicated training. The certification process was demanding. Hundreds of hours of training beyond the regular classes, detailed study of techniques and their applications, philosophy discussions about the ethics of violence, practical teaching under James's supervision. But all 6 students persevered, understanding they were being entrusted with something important. At the certification ceremony, James addressed the 6 new instructors. "What I've taught you over this past year is more than techniques. It's a responsibility. You're now carriers of knowledge that can seriously harm people. That means you have to be more disciplined, more thoughtful, more careful than others. You have to understand that every student you teach becomes your responsibility. What they do with the knowledge, how they apply it, whether they use it wisely or foolishly." He paused, meeting each person's eyes. "I've lost 8 students to violence over my career. 8 people I trained who died in situations where maybe better teaching would have saved them. I carry those names every day. You need to understand that if you teach this material, you'll carry similar weight. Not all your students will survive. That's the nature of life. But you'll wonder about the ones who don't. Question whether you prepared them adequately, carry them with you. That's the cost of being an instructor in combat arts. So why do it? Derek asked. If the weight is so heavy, why keep teaching? Because the alternative is letting the knowledge die. Because passing forward wisdom earned through hard experience is how we honor those who came before us. Because every student who survives a dangerous situation using something you taught them makes the weight a little lighter. We teach because we must, because we can, because we've been given knowledge that's too valuable to keep to ourselves. James reached into his bag and pulled out 6 simple black belts. Not fancy, not ornate, just functional cloth belts that had been his own over the decades. These belong to me at various stages of my training. I'm giving one to each of you, not as rank, this gym doesn't work that way, but as reminders. Reminders that martial arts are a journey, not a destination. That mastery is measured in decades, not years. That what you know today is just the beginning of what you'll learn over a lifetime. The ceremony ended with a demonstration, all 6 certified instructors sparring with James simultaneously. A chaotic melee that showed how far they'd come. James, at 81 years old, moved through them with the grace and precision that had defined his entire martial arts career, not defeating them, but demonstrating principles, showing openings, teaching even in the middle of combat. When it ended, all 7 of them were exhausted, laughing, bound together by shared experience and shared commitment to preserving something valuable. Later, alone in the gym after everyone had left, James stood on the mat and felt the weight of his years, the good and the bad, the people saved and the people lost, the knowledge earned and the knowledge passed forward. 81 years old, 66 years of martial arts training, 45 years carrying the weight of 8 lost students, and now 6 new instructors who would carry it forward, who would teach their own students, who would create a living legacy that extended beyond James's individual life. He thought about Thompson, Rodriguez, Pak, Gonzalez, Chen, Williams, Okoye, Martinez, the 8 names he'd carried for decades. And he thought about Derek, Sasha, Marcus Jr., and the others who'd learned from him at Iron Temple, about the hundreds of students he'd taught over the years who were still alive, still training, still applying what he'd taught them. The weight would never disappear, but it was balanced now, distributed across many shoulders, transformed from crushing burden into shared responsibility. James locked up the gym, turned off the lights, and walked out into the evening. His joints ached, his back complained, his hands showed the accumulated damage of 6 decades of training. But he felt lighter than he had in years, because he'd found a way to pass it forward, to transform private grief into shared wisdom, to ensure that what he'd learned through loss could help others survive. And that, finally, was enough. Closing the Iron Temple MMA gym continues its work in the industrial district, producing fighters and teaching martial arts to people of all ages and skill levels. But something fundamental has changed about the culture, a depth, a seriousness, an understanding that the arts they practice have roots in traditions designed for life or death situations. James Chen is 84 now, still training 3 mornings a week, still teaching his Friday classes when his body allows. The years have slowed him physically. The movements are still precise but less explosive. The techniques still effective but requiring more careful execution. But the knowledge has only deepened, refined by continued practice and the clarity that comes with age. Derek Watts won his championship title and defended it twice before retiring to focus on teaching. He runs the intermediate program at Iron Temple, applying James's methods with his own modern understanding of MMA. He tells his students about the day an 80-year-old man submitted him in seconds and changed his understanding of what martial arts could be. Sasha opened her own gym focused on practical self-defense, teaching women and smaller people how to protect themselves using the control techniques and principle-based approach James taught her. She requires all her instructors to spend time at Iron Temple learning from James directly, understanding that the technical knowledge needs to be grounded in the philosophy that gives it meaning. Marcus Jr. took over day-to-day management of Iron Temple when his father stepped back, but he defers to James on matters of curriculum and teaching philosophy. The gym has become known regionally as a place where serious martial artists go not just to train, but to understand the deeper dimensions of combat arts, the history, the responsibility, the weight. The 6 certified instructors have trained dozens more, creating a lineage that extends James's influence beyond his individual teaching. They maintain standards, emphasizing character development alongside technical skill, ensuring that students understand they're learning arts that require ethical framework and personal discipline. James's Friday morning class has become legendary. Fighters travel from neighboring states to attend, understanding that they're learning from a living link to martial arts traditions that predate sport fighting, that connect modern MMA to its roots in military combatives and battlefield arts. But James also changed. The act of teaching, of passing forward knowledge in a context where students weren't going into combat, slowly lightened the weight he'd carried for decades. The 8 names are still there: Thompson, Rodriguez, Pak, Gonzalez, Chen, Williams, Okoye, Martinez. But they're balanced now by hundreds of others, students who learned from him and went on to teach others. Fighters who survived dangerous situations using techniques he showed them. People whose lives were improved by understanding that martial arts were about more than violence, that true mastery included restraint and judgment. On his 84th birthday, the gym threw a celebration. Students from across the years returned, some who'd trained with him for months, others for years. They shared stories, demonstrated techniques, honored the man who'd given them more than just fighting skills. Derek gave a speech. "When I first met James Chen, I was an arrogant champion who thought I knew everything about fighting. He taught me humility in seconds and wisdom over years. He showed me that true mastery isn't about defeating opponents, but about understanding violence so deeply that you rarely need to use it. He gave me not just techniques, but a philosophy, a way of approaching martial arts that transformed them from sport into something deeper and more meaningful. More than that, he taught me about carrying weight, about understanding that knowledge and skill create responsibility, about honoring those who came before us by passing forward what they taught us, about living with consequences and finding purpose despite them. James Chen is not just a martial arts master, he's a teacher in the fullest sense, someone who shapes not just bodies, but character." When James stood to respond, he was brief. "I'm grateful for all of you, for giving an old soldier a place to continue training, for listening when I shared stories, for taking seriously the lessons I tried to pass forward. You've made these final years meaningful in ways I didn't expect. Thank you for letting me teach. Thank you for learning. Thank you for carrying it forward." The celebration continued into the evening, but James slipped away early, returning to the simple apartment where he lived alone. On his wall hung photographs, young soldiers in various uniforms from various decades, including the 8 who died. Next to them, newer photos: Derek receiving his championship belt, Sasha teaching a women's self-defense class, Marcus Jr. demonstrating a technique to a group of attentive students, the 6 certified instructors at their graduation ceremony, the old and the new, the lost and the living, the weight and the legacy. James Chen, 84 years old, retired special, forces operator, martial arts master, teacher, carrier of names and wisdom, and the understanding that violence is serious business requiring serious people to practice it responsibly. He stood looking at the photographs, thinking about the arc of his life, from young soldier learning judo at 15, to combat veteran using those skills to survive, to instructor teaching others, to old man still training, because stopping would mean abandoning the core of who he was. The weight remained, always would, but it was bearable now, distributed across many shoulders, transformed from crushing burden into shared responsibility and living tradition. At 84, James Chen had finally found peace not in forgetting or moving past the violence of his life, but in ensuring that the wisdom earned through that violence served others, in teaching restraint along with technique, in emphasizing responsibility along with skill, in creating a lineage of martial artists who understood that true strength included knowing when not to fight. The 8 names would always echo, but they were joined now by hundreds of others, students who lived, who learned, who passed it forward in turn. And that was enough. More than enough. Everything. End. For all who carry the weight of violence and all who teach the next generation to carry it wisely,